Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling something that affects pretty much all of us, how a drug actually gets the green light for use in the United States. It might seem like a maze, but there's a really smart logic behind it all, so let's jump right in.
All right, let's start with this because it's a great question. We hear about the brand new cutting-edge drugs, and we hear about the cheap generics, but there's this whole world in the middle. And understanding that world reveals a system that's doing this constant balancing act, trying to spur incredible innovation while also making sure medicines are affordable. The best way to get our heads around this is to think of it like a map. The FDA has laid out a few different routes a drug company can take to get to the finish line, to get to market. And the route they pick? Well, it all depends on the kind of drug they've made. So the first route is the big one. We'll call it the main highway. This is your 505(b)(1) New Drug Application, or NDA. This is for the pioneers, the brand new medicines, the new chemical entities that have never existed before. This path is a massive undertaking. It means the company has to do it all themselves. Years of preclinical research, massive clinical trials, all new data, from scratch. But here's the thing. The vast majority of new drugs aren't created completely out of thin air like that. Most of the time, development involves improving or, copying drugs that we already know work. And for those situations, our map has a really important fork in the road. This fork in the road was put there back in 1984 by a really game-changing law called the Hatch-Waxman Act. The whole point was to strike a balance. So it created two new abbreviated pathways. Think of them as shortcuts designed to get safe, effective, and cheaper drugs to patients a whole lot faster. Okay, so let's go down that first shortcut. This path is designed for one thing and one thing only, making a perfect copy, a replica of a drug that's already out there. This is the 505J pathway, but everyone just calls it the ANDA, the Abbreviated New Drug Application. With this one, the goal is sameness. The generic has to be a duplicate of the original brand name drug, which has a technical name, the Reference Listed Drug, or RLD. It basically piggybacks on the FDA's original safety approval of that drug. So no need for brand new safety trials. All it has to do is prove it's bioequivalent, which is just a fancy way of saying it acts the exact same way in the body. But what if you're not making an exact copy? What if you're making an innovative remix? An improvement on what's already there? Well, for that, we turn to our second shortcut. And this is the 505(b)(2) pathway. Think of it as a hybrid. You still have to give the FDA the full story on your drug's safety and effectiveness, but, and here's the magic part, you're allowed to rely on data that you didn't create. You can use published scientific studies or even the FDA's own findings from when it approved a different drug. It's a huge time and money saver. And this is where things get really cool. Because this pathway is super flexible. It allows for all kinds of valuable improvements. For example, maybe you figured out a new use for an old drug, or you turned a hard-to-swallow pill into a liquid for kids. Maybe you made it a skin patch instead of a shot, or just created a more convenient strength. All of those innovations can use this path. So if you're a drug company, you've got these two shortcuts, the replica and the remix. But here's the catch. The choice isn't always up to you. There's a really important rule you have to follow. And here it is, straight from the horse's mouth. The FDA's regulations are crystal clear. They basically say, look, if your drug is a copy, you must use the copy pathway. You can't try to game the system and use the remix path just to get some extra benefits. If you try, the FDA will literally refuse to even look at your application. So really, it all boils down to this. For the generic ANDA path, your entire goal is to prove sameness, that you are a perfect duplicate. But for the hybrid 505(b)(2) path, your goal is to prove difference, to justify why your change is meaningful, and then prove that it's still safe and effective. And that difference in philosophy leads to a huge practical difference. For a generic, you're actually not allowed to submit new clinical trials to prove safety. I mean, why would you? It's supposed to be a duplicate. But for a 505(b)(2) drug, you almost always need new studies to provide the evidence for whatever change you've made. This chart really lays out the strategic trade-offs perfectly. A generic relies completely on the original drug's data and, in return, gets no new market exclusivity. Zip. A 505(b)(2), on the other hand, is more work. You've got to bring your own data to bridge the gap. But the reward can be huge. The potential for new patents and new periods of market exclusivity. That's a massive incentive to innovate. So you might be wondering, just how flexible is this 505(b)(2) pathway? How different can these remixes be? Well, it turns out it covers a surprisingly huge spectrum, from tiny tweaks to really significant changes.
Let's just look at the two extremes. On one end, you have a drug like Emflaza. This was actually a whole new molecule, a new chemical entity. But because its approval was partly based on existing published studies, it used the 505(b)(2) path. Now, on the complete opposite end, you have something like tigecycline. This was an injectable that was almost a generic, but it had one little change in its formulation. And that one tiny difference meant it wasn't a duplicate, so it had to use the 505(b)(2) path.
Okay, I know that was a lot of numbers and regulations. So let's get to the big question. Why does this whole three-path system even matter? Why should we care?
It matters because this whole thing is a carefully crafted balancing act. The generic ANDA pathway is our engine for affordability. It makes sure there's a steady supply of low-cost, reliable medicines. But at the same time, the 505(b)(2) pathway gives companies a powerful reason to keep innovating on the drugs we already have, to make them better, safer, and more convenient.
So, you see, it's not just a bunch of red tape. It's a powerful policy engine. This whole framework is the tool that lets us have our cake and eat it too. It gives us the affordable access we need, and it drives the valuable ongoing innovation that we want.
Which really just leaves us with one final big question. This system was designed in 1984 for the drugs of that era, but today we're in a whole new world of complex biologics, gene therapies, and personalized medicine. So you have to wonder, how is this approval map going to need to be redrawn to handle the incredible and incredibly complex therapies of tomorrow?